In the Gospel of Mark, chapter 7, verse 8, we read that Jesus Christ said, quote, "You have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to human traditions," end quote. This points to something of crucial importance to understand concerning a human being's place in society and the bigger picture of where we fit in God's plan and in God's sight. Before referencing other Bible verses to make it clear that appeal to tradition, appeal to authority, and appeal to the majority, to make it clear that these are actually the psychological blocks or blunders that keep humanity in conformity with a system, a society that is contrary to God's will, and contrary, of course, as well to the true teachings of the Messiah, who was and is the true Word of God. A statement of crucial importance on this topic was made by the prophet Jeremiah. We can find this in Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 8. It reads, quote, "How can you say, 'We are wise, we have the law of the Lord'? See, that has been changed into falsehood by the lying pen of the scribes," end quote. So here Jeremiah is saying that you think you understand God's law. You think you understand God's will. But you don't, because you are taking falsehood written by scribes, in other words, editors and writers of religious text. You're taking their writing as authoritative. You're taking their writing as the gospel truth, right? You're even calling it the Word of God, when in fact it's falsehood. So your wisdom is actually ignorance. So a couple of key elements need to be addressed and understood here. Number one, what is the true law of God? And number two, what is the significance of the fact that there are these lying scribes, right? Why are they lying in the first place? And is there an equivalent to that activity happening today? And if so, what does it look like in our daily lives? How do we recognize it? And how do we recognize our own moral failing in simply outsourcing our own critical thinking, right? Outsourcing our own conscience to so-called authorities, or to whatever is most popular, or to whatever has been established as a tradition in the culture that we were brought up in. So of utmost importance is clarity on God's law. And this isn't complicated in its overview. There's definitely subtleties that need to be explored and understood, but the overarching concept or principle is not complicated. And there's been a concerted effort to make it complicated or make it obscure. The Messiah made it clear to us. He said, the entire law of God, the whole law, can be condensed or encapsulated into what he said are the greatest commandments. Now, this is extremely significant, and it's repeatedly marginalized. Its significance is repeatedly marginalized by the church. What he's saying is a clarification that didn't exist prior. He's not just reiterating old ideas. He's separating the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. He's helping us discern what the truth is compared to what the falsehood is that has been presented to us by that lying pen of the scribes and any other source that we encounter in our lives, giving us a supposed moral truth. He gave us the bedrock to stand on. He gave us the true moral compass, which is comprehensive love towards the three main actors that we can actually express love towards in our lives as human beings. And that is love towards God, love towards others, and love towards ourselves. This basic idea is completely absent from most of mainstream Christianity. They don't even accept the fact that self-love is part of this principle, even though it clearly is in black and white. To love God with your whole heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love others as yourself. Right? You obviously can't love others if you don't love yourself, according to this law, right? If you don't love yourself and you're loving others according to how you think of yourself, obviously that's not going to manifest as love towards others. This is the most basic logic, and it's a sad state of affairs that this needs to be spelled out, because it's just so simple and obvious. It's ridiculous that people see this as confusing. So, although we are bombarded by falsehood and propaganda on a daily basis, and humanity has been for centuries, you have to take some responsibility for your own possible willful ignorance and inability to use basic critical thinking, right? Conformity to authority and the majority and tradition literally makes people dumb. It literally lowers your IQ because you're not exercising critical thinking. So how can you exercise intelligence if you're basically turning your own intelligence off and just accepting whatever you're told? In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 7, we read Yeshua having said, quote, "Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the road is broad that leads to destruction. And those who enter through it are many. How narrow the gate and constricted the road that leads to life, and those who find it are few." End quote. This is profound. Yeshua is saying very explicitly, very clearly, that most people are on the broad, wide road to destruction. And there's only a few that find the narrow way that leads to life or leads to salvation. This was not just true in his time, it's most certainly still true today. But what does that mean? I mean, what are the implications of that? And why would society be in such a state? Why would it be that the majority are misled? Why would it be that most people are following falsehood? Right? These are questions you should contemplate. Because the answer, once you take some time to just think independently and critically about it, the answer is not hard to come to. It's a logical, simple conclusion. Just as self-love is obviously a part of the greatest commandments, if most people are following falsehood, if most people are on the broad road to destruction, that means that most people are being misled. Right? Most people aren't following the truth communicated by the Messiah, right? Because he came to give us the truth that sets us free, right? To get us on this narrow road. So there's obviously a counter force, right? And what is that counter force? What does it actually look like in society? Well, again, Jeremiah pointed directly to it. One major form of it. It was, you could call, the media of his day, right? The scribes, the writers of truth, right? That were giving a particular religious dogma, a particular narrative that was false and was leading people on the broad road of destruction. So, if you find yourself conforming to a majority view, you should be wary of that. You should question that. You shouldn't find comfort in that or think that you're somehow wise because your default perspective is whatever the majority believes or whatever so-called authorities tell you. And the thing to keep in mind here too of crucial importance, especially in modern days, is authority, and propaganda is not obvious. That's how it works. So if you're expecting, if you think you're alert to propaganda because if some, like Dr. Evil character shows up on your TV screen and, starts saying some authoritarian craziness, you're not going to follow that. Like, if you think that's, if you think that's like what you need to be wary of, you're mistaken. That's not how it works. Because if it was obviously some, evil character on the TV screen, if the devil was this, all red character with horns and a tail, and he's saying something to you, you'd be like, oh, well, you're obviously the devil, so I'm not going to listen to you, right? That's not how it works. It's deceptive, right? So it comes through means that you wouldn't necessarily expect it to come through. Like, for example, advertising. Most people just think advertising is this mundane, corporate thing. It's just businesses trying to make a profit. They never consider the possibility that it's actually used by the powers that be to transmit certain narratives. It may be also, serving the purpose of profiting a certain business or what have you, but it's also used as a vehicle for propaganda, just as entertainment is, just as movies and TV shows are. So on the surface, it's like, oh, this is just entertainment. This is just a movie. This is just a TV show, or this is just social media posts. But think about it. If you were trying to deceive millions of people, you couldn't just be upfront about it, right? You would have to use these sneaky, underhanded, below the surface methods in order to influence people, right? So that they don't even realize that they're being deceived. And this is documented that, for example, government has basically scripted many portions of movies and TV shows, and has been involved in advertising as well. I don't want to go too far down that, so-called rabbit hole. But the point is, the continuance of deception on a mass scale has not only continued since the time of Jeremiah, but it's actually accelerated and has become, much more advanced in its methodology and pervasiveness, right? Because now we have cell phones and other forms of media coming at us from all sides, advertising all over the place. Music, again, is another sort of Trojan horse where certain narratives are pushed, especially in Christian radio. The lyrics are used to push a certain worldview, namely the Paulinist view on humanity and salvation, in particular the doctrine on human depravity and blood atonement, soteriology. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 15, verse 14, we read, quote, "Leave them. They are blind guides. And if the blind lead the blind, both will fall into a pit," end quote. This corresponds to the Messiah's other teaching, where he was speaking to the religious authorities saying, not only do you not enter the kingdom, but you prevent others from entering as well. And then this brings me back to the bigger picture of, well, why would they do this in the first place? A lot of people, I think, have a hard time accepting this conspiracy theory, you can call it, that there are people that actively seek to deceive the population in a way that is detrimental to their spiritual health and salvation. It just sounds, crazy. It's like, why would there be such a concerted effort to do that? Why were those scribes lying and writing falsehoods about the law of God, right? Why was that occurring? Well, follow the money is a classic, principle as far as discovering possible motives, right? And in the context of the temple in the time of Yeshua's ministry, that was a huge money-making slaughterhouse operation going on there, right? People bringing these animals to the temple to supposedly, wash away their sins in the blood of the animal. And then these temple priests would sell that animal flesh on the meat market and make a huge profit, right? Because they're getting the supply for free, hand delivered to them. So it was a hugely profitable business. And then we, of course, read in the Gospels that After Yeshua specifically, and directly confronted that temple slaughterhouse operation, he was then, sought to be crucified, right, by these religious authorities. They then rallied together to present him to the Roman authorities to have him crucified. So there's definitely truth to that on the surface level, but then there is a deeper spiritual dynamic, right? Why did the serpent in the Garden of Eden, try to deceive Adam and Eve in the first place? Was it, for monetary gain? Clearly not, right? Money didn't even exist at that point, right? So the monetary profit motive can lead us to the deeper underlying drive, which is actually the drive of evil. It is the satanic impulse, you could say. It is the will of Satan, right? We have the will of God, and then there's this opposing will of Satan. And Satan is basically hell-bent on undermining the will of God. He wants to turn people away from God's will. And what is God's will? Again, the greatest commandments. And in the 10 commandments, what are the first 2 commandments? And why are they first? Is there a reason why they would be put at the top of the list? So the first is saying that we should have no other gods before the true God, before Abba Father, the good creator. And the second is saying that we should have no carved image, right? No idols. But both of these commandments can actually be considered commandments against idolatry, and social idolatry in particular. Right? People can make a god of politics. They can make a god of family, a god of culture, right? You can make other elements of society and other people and other traditions. These can be a god of a sort in your life, right? And likewise, a carved image doesn't necessarily have to be a statue, like a physical carved image of some pagan god. It can be other physical objects, like a book, right? Like a book, which not only is a physical object that can be idolized, as the Bible is, but it can also simultaneously be a vehicle for idolatry of particular men, right? The people that wrote the text in that Bible and translated the text in that Bible. And to have just complete blind faith that no mistranslations were made, no purposeful interpolation took place, no editing, no lying pen of the scribes, right? Nope. It's just 100% perfect from front to back. That is idolatry, 100%. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 10, verse 35, Yeshua said, quote, "I have come to set a man against his father and a daughter against her mother," end quote. So he came to disentangle individuals from their conformity to groups that were aligned with falsehood, right? False morality in particular. But most don't answer that call, right? Most choose conformity. Most choose fearful adherence to whatever their family says, their culture says, the mass media says, so-called authorities say. They're a slave to sin through idolatry. And that's why those are the first two of the 10 commandments, because if you're an idol worshiper, you're, dead in the water, so to speak. Your spiritual journey is a non-starter. And that's why conformity is so much pushed as an actual virtue, right? It's a false virtue. If you were to accept that there are very corrupt, ill-intentioned individuals at the top of the social system globally, what they want the least is virtuous individuals that adhere to the greatest commandments of the Messiah, because that doesn't jive with their program, right? You basically have to be corrupt to conform to a corrupt system that's based on immorality, namely extortion, right? This idea that these systems, well, the political in particular, is a benevolent service provider, even though this so-called service originates in what is otherwise considered criminal for normal individuals to do, which is carry out extortion, right? To demand payment for a service without an actual contract being signed, and regardless of how well that service is carried out, if at all. The same inversion exists in the other systems, or the other subsystems of the overarching satanic system. The medical system, right? Does it actually lead you towards preventative health, right? Preventative medicine, good nutrition, detoxification, cleansing of parasites and heavy metals? No, not at all, right? They actually push so-called solutions that just maintain the problem and oftentimes make it worse, right? That damage the health of children, adults, and the elderly throughout their entire lives, and people keep returning to them because they're idol worshippers that can't fathom the idea that so-called authorities don't know what they're talking about at all concerning helpful information, right? Same goes for the system of education, the education system. What are they actually teaching children? Crucial truth? Critical thinking? No. They're teaching them conformity and propaganda. The banking system, banking institution, are they encouraging saving and investing and asset acquisition, right? Land ownership? No. Complete opposite. They're encouraging and facilitating the acquisition of debt, right? To become a debt slave. It's not financial security whatsoever, right? A bank is supposed to represent financial security, but they teach people how to become financially insecure. A hospital is supposed to represent health and well-being. It produces the exact opposite. The political theater, political establishment is supposed to be promoting social justice and security, and they produce the complete opposite. And this should become obvious to you after some time, after so many years of being a human, and just observing their fruit, right? Know them by their fruits. But a lot of people just continue to turn a blind eye to the fact that these institutions, these systems are deceiving people continually. Of course, including the religious institution that just pushes this false theology that is, again, amoral, right? Saying that turning away from good works, turning away from sin and embracing good works is actually the false doctrine, right? They'll call that the doctrine of demons. It's complete psychological projection, complete inversion, right? The church is supposed to represent a resource for alignment with God's will and salvation, and they do the complete opposite, right? So if you just weren't an idol worshiper, right? If you just expected major institutions to be propaganda machines, as they've always been, right? Because the people that run them from the top and send those orders down to, the local level are ill-intentioned. If you could grasp just that simple concept, you would just stop listening to them, stop going to them. But most people don't do that. Most people keep going back. They keep going back to the hospital. They keep going back to the voting booth, right? They keep going back to the bank, get another credit card, get another loan. We've been duped into following the lead of actors with an agenda that is contrary to the will of God. The will of God is for us to be set free through obedience to God's law of love in particular. People keep turning to false authority for solutions and for the truth, and they just keep getting deceived over and over again, because of their idolatry. And that's why the first commandments of the 10 commandments are against idolatry. And that's why Yeshua repeatedly taught against making these social idols. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 14, verse 26, we read that Yeshua said, quote, "If anyone comes to me without hating his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple," end quote. Now the word hating there in the original language and context of social idioms of the time is speaking to prioritization, right? So it's not talking about just having a right off the bat hatred for your family for no reason. It's saying that you should not prioritize them and their views in particular over discipleship to the true Word of God, right? You cannot be his disciple if you're promoting family first. That doesn't mean, be abusive to your family. It's just getting your priorities straight, because people in your family may be deceived, right? As most people are. Again, most people are on the broad road to destruction, right? Most people are conformists. Most people are idol worshipers. Most people operate psychologically via logical fallacies, right? Appeal to majority, otherwise known as argumentum ad populum. Appeal to authority, otherwise known as advercundium. In sociology, we have the term social, or the idea of social identity theory, that points out that many people derive their own self-esteem from group membership, right? You probably recognize this in your own life, especially when you were younger, right? That when you are part of a group, it can be like a self-confidence boost. You just feel like you're more together internally because you're more together socially. And anyone who's outside the group, who's not a conformist, who's not part of the in group or the in crowd, is ostracized. And you can also get a so-called, ego boost through joining in that slandering of the outsider, for example. Right? Conformity has its rewards. They're cheap rewards, but you get praise, you get status, and you get your gossip cliques, your echo chambers, and there's a sense of security in being part of that rather than being, the outcast. It's pathetic, really. It's sad that people cling to that as, their security blanket. And it's also pathetic in an ethical sense as far as one's own morality, to believe something as foolish as, if everyone believes it, it must be true. Whatever the majority thinks, it must be true. Right? Just appeal to popularity, appeal to majority, appeal to tradition. Those are called logical fallacies because they're dumb, right? Because it's poor reasoning. It's a bad argument, right? If that's in a debate, if you utilize a logical fallacy, you lose the debate because you're dumb, basically, right? Just to use blunt terms, you're giving a dumb, bad argument, so you lose. And it's the same in a spiritual context. You lose if you cling to false morality and false gods. If you've already surrendered your moral agency, right, if you're already violating the first 2 of the 10 commandments, you're not going to be able to carry out the other 8, right? Again, you're dead in the water. You're a sheeple. You're caught up in the herd mentality. Right? Herd mentality is idolatry and moral bankruptcy in God's sight. There were a few notable philosophers and theologians in the 19th and 20th century that spoke against this. And of course, their teachings are not emphasized. And most people, in the current generation probably haven't even heard of them or heard of what they were talking about. But the social psychologist Stanley Milgram, Milgram, in his study on conformity overriding morality is significant to be aware of. The famous 19th century philosopher Soren Kierkegaard famously declared that the crowd is untruth. If you're going with the crowd, you're following lies. Which brings us, back to the statement by Jeremiah that if you're following the mainstream narrative, you're not actually aligned with the truth or God's will or God's law. There was a 20th century theologian and pastor by the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was a pastor who he was German, who opposed the Nazi regime. And he spoke against what he called the mass man, aka the conformist. Right? And this conformist was noted to be actually the most dangerous person. Right? Contrary to what we're told, that it's the outcast, the nonconformist, that's the crazy, dangerous one. It's actually the mass man. It's actually the mainstream conformist that's the most dangerous, because they just maintain the system. They just maintain the status quo, which is the road to destruction, right? Most people are just Agent Smith, so to speak, that work to, get everyone back in line, and if you try to be independent from that, like crabs in a bucket, they want to pull you back down. Bonhoeffer even said that, that this resistance to the crowd is a fundamental act of Christian obedience. And that's correct, as I've been pointing out here. And as Yeshua pointed out to all of us via his ministry and teachings in that ministry that, of course, are not emphasized by the Pauline Church. In the book of Acts, chapter 5, verse 29, the Apostle Peter says, quote, "We must obey God rather than human beings," end quote. And a lot of Christians will nod yes to that, but they don't actually follow it at all. The very fact that they believe that the Bible is the perfect, infallible, inerrant Word of God shows that they're not following that, because they're just idolizing the writers, and councils that put together these scriptures and edited them and excluded certain texts and included others, like the letters of Paul, and just said they're the Word of God now, right? That's all obedience to human beings, the traditions of men. Right? Returning to the words of Jesus in Mark chapter 7, verse 8, quote, "You have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to human traditions," end quote. But so many people are so perfectly deceived, they don't realize that they're doing this, right? They'll read that verse and they'll think, oh, well, I'm not doing that. I'm not going against the commands of God and clinging to human traditions, right? Completely oblivious to the fact that one of the main ways they violate that is exercised by them every single day, 3 times a day, right? By what they eat. They think enslaving and murdering animals is perfectly fine. It's just simply exercising dominion over the animal kingdom. God gave us permission to eat meat after the flood. No problem there, right? They're completely deceived. It's 100% a violation of the greatest commandments, in particular the commandment to be loving towards others, which obviously should include any sentient life, right? Any being that is conscious, feels pain, has emotions, and wants to live, right? Their intelligence is irrelevant, right? A pig or a dog doesn't have the psychological capacity of a human being in certain respects, but neither does a disabled person or child, right? They're still both conscious, they still both deserve basic respect, and they both have the right to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, right? To think that killing and eating animals for no good reason whatsoever is a perfect encapsulation of human failure, human moral failure, and a failure of critical thinking, right? Because why do people not recognize that obvious fact that certainly humans can be healthy on a plant-based diet, right? And not only can they be healthy, but they tend to be healthier than those that aren't, right? Just complete willful ignorance of that, and a ignorant clinging to what their family says, what authorities say, what the church says, what the media says. And so they just go on being completely unmerciful towards animals, and they think God doesn't care at all. Why? Because this book says so, right? I mean, there's Genesis 1:29 that says plants are our food, but then there's these other verses that say, oh no, it's perfectly fine. So this is just a perfect example, a huge example of how people outsource their critical thinking and their conscience to the crowd, to authorities. And they're so sure that they're on the right side. And they're so deceived that they think anyone saying that we should be merciful to animals is actually the deceiver, right? That's perfect deception, when you not only believe abuse is good, but you believe that those advocating love are the evil ones. That's how insane society has become under this mass deception that has been going on for centuries, right? Satan's little season. You may have also encountered the verse, "Woe to you when all people speak well of you. So their fathers did to the false prophets." Again, a teaching and a warning against conformity and appeal to authority, false authority, false gods. You probably have heard the old Revolutionary War slogan, or maybe not probably anymore, being that this kind of perspective is definitely suppressed, but there was a Revolutionary War slogan that went, "Resistance to tyrants is obedience to God." Right? And that was inspired, no doubt, by the Apostle Peter, again, who said we must obey God rather than human beings. Another version of this, modernized and put in a particular context, post the so-called, COVID era, COVID years, is that mass media is the virus, or the media is the virus. You might see that as a bumper sticker. I have that bumper sticker myself. So, what is, again, the key takeaway here? To recognize that there is mass deception going on, there is constant propaganda going on by these institutions, by these systems, and their by the satanic system and its subsystems that offer the inversion of what they claim to be providing, right? The media news is supposedly there to keep you informed, but it's actually just there to keep you deceived, to keep you in line with the narrative, right? Because you just see the friendly, news reporter or professional news reporter just apparently just stating the facts, and you think, oh, I'm just staying informed, right? A huge example occurring right now, summer of 2026, is all of these so-called wildfires that are just completely out of control all throughout the United States and Canada as well, spreading toxic smoke, engulfing entire regions in toxic smoke, and of course threatening the lives of millions of people and wildlife, and destroying, the last bit of wild spaces that still exist. And people dumbly accept whatever the mass media tells them about it. Oh, this is global warming, or, it's just because we have an exceptionally dry summer, or has nothing to do with the management of these forests, right? It has nothing to do with the fact that underbrush was left on the forest floor, right? And the canopies are exposed because of clear cutting, right? This is, forest management 101 is understanding how not to set up a tinderbox, right? They understand, they know why it's happening. And you have to really be stupid and really be a fool to just buy whatever nonsense the mainstream media tells you about what's going on, right? Oh, it's solar flares, or, again, global warming. Or they'll try and blame shift and tell you, oh, it's because of irresponsible campers, or it's because you have, that dead limb on your tree that's overhanging your house, Only you can prevent forest fires, right? Smokey the Bear, there to gaslight the nation, right? It has nothing to do with the powers that be that have set this up as an act of domestic terrorism, just as the whole, COVID scenario was actually as well, right? People just accept the BS, accept the narrative, and just keep going round and round on the hamster wheel of deception and conformity to an abusive system, rather than obedience to the law of God and finding freedom through that, psychologically and socially. And that social freedom doesn't mean that everyone would be isolated from one another. Still form, of course, voluntary communities. That's a very natural thing to occur. A very natural drive of humans to want to connect with other humans and form strong, healthy communities. But it would be founded on the right principle, namely the greatest commandments, in secular philosophy and ethics. The key component of that being the non-aggression principle, recognizing that relations should be voluntary from the start. Can't build social justice on a foundation of injustice, again, namely extortion. And everyone should have access to homesteading land, water, and seed, so that they can have that economic stability and security and be able to not be slaves to a monetary system. Mainstream followers of, the establishment are various forms of cult members, right? The modern Pauline Christian Church has basically become a blood cult. And blood clot, of course, fitting in with the previously mentioned deception. But then we also have like the entertainment industry, which is really a depravity cult, getting people to just embrace depravity. Again, because those in power don't want people to stand on principle and virtue, because that would undermine their agenda and continuance. And the medical industry is actually a death cult. They push harm while claiming to be, champions of healthcare. The education system is actually a deception cult, and the whole state/government system is actually a slavery cult, right? Being enslaved to these so-called authorities, being their obedient tax cattle, rather than sovereign individuals, which are made out to be, crazy people, selfish, Anytime sovereign individual is mentioned in the media, it's always associated with someone, mentally unwell and violent, because that's how they operate. They always want to hijack any good movement and place bad actors in there to discredit that movement. And people just fall for it over and over again because they don't see through it. They don't see how they're actually opposing what's principled through deception, right? And that's a key method of deception, is hijacking and inverting good movements. And that's exactly what the so-called Apostle Paul did with the ministry of Yeshua. It was hijacked and then inverted to the point where now people believe that obedience to the moral law is actually the false gospel, and that blood magic is the true gospel. Likewise, people think veganism is the wicked agenda, right? Leaving animals alone is this wicked agenda, right? Eating organic fruits and vegetables, having a home garden and orchard is somehow the devil's work, right? Returning to the Garden of Eden is Satan's plan. Complete inversion, complete deception, perfect deception. The perfectly deceived, who not only don't realize they're deceived, but think that the people speaking the truth are the enemy. People advocating the non-aggression principle in various ways are made out to be extremist, made out to be, dangerous. Right? Someone advocating gun rights, right? The ability to defend yourself against criminals or tyrannical governments, that's dangerous, right? When in fact the danger is in having a disarmed population who can then be victimized by criminals and tyrants and terrorists, right? The obvious clear truth and ethics is completely lost in the propaganda, right? That people get caught up in and don't use any critical thinking to analyze because they're, again, idol worshippers. Likewise, that's why people ignore those pointing out that Paul is a false apostle, right? They just immediately revert to their idolatry of a book, those that wrote the book, of their church, of their pastors, of their family, and also, fear social death, right? They fear being an outcast. So all that just keeps them lockstep. Humans being non-aggressive towards other humans, aka a voluntary society, right? Where we actually share the earth, share the land and water and seed with one another. That's the crazy view, right? That's the unrealistic view. But conformity to a satanic system, founded on extortion and deception, oh no, that's the way we got to keep going. Don't let anyone steer you away from that. Hold the line, hold the course. We have to stay together, right? This false sense of community, which is really just conformity to a evil system. Somehow humans not being aggressive towards other humans and people being non-aggressive towards animals, somehow that's a doctrine of demons, It's just false teachers out there pushing this principle of love. Don't listen to them. Go back to your so-called authorities, go back to your idols, because surely they're leading you on that narrow path. If anyone's promoting a vegan diet, you can see right through them, right? They would just want you to eat bugs, right? They're part of an evil agenda that wants you to eat genetically modified foods and insects, right? Even though they're not actually saying anything of the sort, right? Even though there's plenty of people promoting an organic, whole foods, plant-based diet, right? Let's just believe the BS that it's all about insect eating and GMOs. If anyone promotes voluntarism, they're a no-good, extremist who just wants to break up social unity and expose us to threats, right? Rather than end this perpetual violence and terrorism that's exercised on our communities repeatedly, decade after decade, right? Keep exercising that banality of evil, as Hannah Arendt said, keep following orders, keep being a good citizen, keep going to your doctor, right? Keep trusting modern education, keep believing the narratives pushed by entertainment and advertising. Yeah. See how that works out. In Luke chapter 14, verse 34, we read, Jesus said, quote, "Salt is good, but if salt itself loses its taste, with what can its flavor be restored? It is fit neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. It is thrown out. Whoever has ears to hear ought to hear." End quote. Be sure to lose your individual flavor, right? Conform. Don't preserve the true moral teachings of the Messiah, right? Let yourself be watered down by the false doctrines of a false religion. Continue to be an idol worshiper. That will be thrown away. Or as Jesus said in Revelation, he will spit you out of his mouth, right? Because you're lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, neither passionate for the good or against the bad. Give Matthew chapter 25 a reread as well. Be a good finishing study on this topic.